The calm before the storm. Marcus James had always prided himself on his ability to stay calm under pressure. This was a trait that had served him well in his high-stakes profession as one of the most respected surgeons at St. Thomas Medical Center in Brooklyn. He had been through countless surgeries, each one filled with life-or-death decisions, and each one demanding a steady hand and an unwavering mind. His reputation had grown over the years, not just as a brilliant surgeon, but as a man who could compartmentalize his emotions and focus entirely on his patients. It wasn't just his skill with a scalpel that set him apart. It was his calm, his serenity in the face of chaos. The world could be crumbling around him. And yet, Marcus had mastered the art of finding peace in the storm. The operating room, with its sharp smells of antiseptic and the rhythmic beeping of machines, had always felt like a place where time stood still. The weight of the situation, life or death, was something Marcus felt, but never allowed to overcome him. Every incision, every stitch was deliberate, calculated, as if the hands of a watch were ticking in his mind. But tonight, as the wind howled through the streets of Brooklyn, and the city lights flickered faintly through his apartment window, Marcus wasn't thinking about the usual pre-surgery rituals. Tonight, the usual routine had been replaced by something far more urgent. It wasn't a typical evening for Marcus, though, as a call had come through just an hour ago. The voice on the other end had shaken him to his core. It wasn't just any patient. It was a young girl, a child no older than 8, who needed surgery immediately. A little girl, her life hanging by a thread, the kind of situation that struck a chord deep in Marcus's chest. There was something about a child in peril that made even the most seasoned surgeons tremble. This wasn't just any emergency. This was a life-or-death struggle. The little girl's name was Emily, and the urgency of the situation couldn't have been clearer. Her father, a police officer in Brooklyn, had called Marcus directly. His daughter had been in a horrific car accident, and her injuries were severe: internal bleeding, fractures, and internal damage that required immediate intervention. The father's voice had been shaky, desperate, but firm. Marcus knew there was no time to waste. Even now, as he grabbed his leather jacket and threw his phone, wallet, and keys into a bag, Marcus couldn't shake the intensity of the moment. His mind was already racing through the procedure that lay ahead, mentally preparing himself for the hours of work required to save Emily's life. He wasn't worried about the technical aspects. His hands knew what to do. But the emotional weight of it, knowing the child's father was a police officer in his very own community, added a layer of complexity that Marcus hadn't anticipated. As he locked the door behind him, the cold air hit his skin, but Marcus didn't feel it. His mind was elsewhere, already on the task at hand. He was not thinking about the routines that usually accompanied surgery. The sterile gloves, the surgical mask, the quiet focus of the operating room. All of that seemed distant now. His sole focus was getting to the hospital, because every moment that ticked by meant the girl was slipping further away. He could hear the faint echo of sirens in the distance, but they didn't register with him. Brooklyn was a city alive with sound, and sirens were common in these streets. He was accustomed to the hustle, the rush, the chaos of the city. But tonight, the hustle was different. Every second felt like it could make the difference between life and death for Emily. Marcus was racing against time, his car zipping through the dark streets, each turn calculated and urgent. The lights of the city streaked by in a blur as his mind focused entirely on the emergency that awaited him. He knew the usual routes to St. Thomas Medical Center, but tonight they didn't feel quick enough. The heavy traffic of a Friday evening, the crowds, the cars, the lines of stalled vehicles seemed to mock him. Every red light was a moment of precious time lost. He could feel the pressure mounting in his chest, but he kept his grip on the steering wheel steady. In his mind, he ran through the details of Emily's injuries again. Internal bleeding, a ruptured spleen, multiple broken bones. He had seen this before, but never under these circumstances. He wasn't just saving a patient. He was saving a child. the daughter of a man who had sworn to protect and serve. The thought of it, of the fragile life that awaited him, pushed him to move faster. There was no room for hesitation, no time for distractions. And then, just as he neared an intersection, it happened. A sudden flash of red and blue illuminated his rearview mirror, followed by the unmistakable sound of a siren. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't breaking any laws. What was going on? His car slowed involuntarily as the siren wailed, an uncomfortable reminder of the situation he was in. The officer's presence behind him felt like an added weight. Marcus had no time for this, not now. He was a surgeon, not a criminal. His patience, tested over years of high-pressure surgeries, was beginning to wear thin. But this was a different kind of pressure, one that he wasn't accustomed to. He eased his car to the side of the road, frustration welling up inside him as he glanced at the clock. He had lost precious minutes. The hospital was only a few blocks away, but that distance felt like miles when a child's life was on the line. The officer approached his window, and Marcus rolled it down, trying to stay calm. He didn't have the time or the energy for small talk. He needed to get to the hospital, and fast. "Good evening, sir." The officer's voice was cool, almost too casual, considering the urgency of the situation. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Marcus blinked, confused for a moment. He hadn't been speeding, and he hadn't run a red light. He was just trying to get to the hospital. But before he could respond, he heard the officer's next words. "I'm sorry, officer, but I'm on an emergency call. A child is in critical condition, and I need to get to the hospital immediately," Marcus said, his voice calm but urgent. The officer's eyes narrowed as he studied Marcus for a moment, clearly sizing him up. There was something about the way he looked at Marcus that made him uneasy. "Emergency, huh?" the officer asked, his tone skeptical. "What's the rush?" "I'm just trying to keep the streets safe." Marcus was taken aback. "I'm a surgeon," he explained quickly. "A child is dying, and I need to perform surgery on her. She's in critical condition." The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he stood there for a long moment, almost as if weighing the situation. Marcus's anxiety grew with every passing second. There was no time for this. Every second he spent here could be the difference between life and death for Emily. Finally, the officer spoke again, his voice colder this time. "I'm afraid you're going to have to step out of the vehicle, sir. I need to check your ID and registration." Marcus's heart sank. He had been in emergency situations before, times when his life had depended on quick thinking and rapid action. But this was different. This wasn't just another surgery. This wasn't just another case. This was personal. The child he was racing to save was in critical condition, and the officer standing in front of him was about to delay him further. Marcus gritted his teeth, trying to remain calm, but his patience was thinning. "I don't have time for this," he said, his voice tight. "Please, let me go. A little girl is dying." But the officer didn't seem to understand. He gestured for Marcus to step out of the car. "Do you have any idea how fast you were going?" the officer asked. Marcus could feel his blood begin to boil, but he held it together. He had to. His focus had to remain on the task at hand. "Please, officer," Marcus said, trying one last time. "I'm a surgeon. I'm trying to save a life. A child is dying. Please, let me go." The officer's face remained unreadable, but as Marcus hesitated for a moment, the officer's hand hovered near his holster. It was a gesture that told Marcus he had no choice but to comply. With a deep sigh, Marcus opened the door and stepped out onto the cold pavement. The icy wind cut through his coat, but he barely noticed. His mind was already on Emily, already in the operating room, already calculating the steps he would take to save her life. The last thing he needed was to be held up on the side of the road by an officer who didn't understand the gravity of the situation. But as Marcus stood there, trying to maintain his composure, something unexpected happened. The officer's voice cracked slightly. "Wait a second," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Marcus James." The name hit Marcus like a punch in the gut. Marcus froze. The officer stepped closer, his demeanor shifting. "You're the surgeon. The Marcus James. The one who works at Street Thomas." Marcus blinked, trying to process the realization. The officer wasn't just another cop. This was someone who knew him, someone who recognized him. And in that moment, everything changed. The officer's face softened, the hardness in his expression replaced by a mixture of disbelief and desperation. "My daughter," he whispered, barely audible. "It's my daughter in the hospital. She's the one who needs you." Marcus's heart skipped a beat as the weight of it all came crashing down. This wasn't just any officer. This was the father of the child Marcus had been called to save. And in that moment, Marcus knew his calmness would be tested like never before. The truth unfolds. The street seemed to hold its breath as Marcus stood facing the officer, the words echoing in his mind like a drumbeat. "It's my daughter. She's the one who needs you." The officer's voice cracked, the hard exterior he had maintained earlier disintegrating like a dam breaking under pressure. Marcus had spent years working through pressure, years spent in operating rooms where life and death were decided in seconds, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The officer, who had just moments ago treated him like a criminal, was now standing before him, broken and vulnerable, asking for his help. For a split second, Marcus's mind went blank. He had always known the power his work held. He had saved countless lives, brought people back from the edge of death. But in that moment, he understood something far deeper. It wasn't just about skill, it was about trust, and the profound weight of being the one person in the world who could offer salvation. He wasn't just a surgeon now, he was someone's last hope. The officer, his face suddenly pale, stepped back, a faint tremor running through his hands as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. It was a hospital note, one that bore the name Emily written in urgent letters. "She's in there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but filled with a mix of sorrow and desperation. "I didn't know it was you. I didn't know." Marcus could feel his pulse thundering in his ears, the reality of the situation crashing over him in waves. There was no time left. The officer had no idea that the man he had just stopped, who he had held on the side of the road, was the very person he needed. The confusion and frustration Marcus felt on the street, the indignity of being treated like a criminal, were suddenly dwarfed by the crushing urgency of the situation. A child's life hung in the balance. Emily's life. Without another word, Marcus turned toward his car, the weight of the officer's realization heavy in the air. The young officer, whose face had once been hard and questioning, now seemed to shrink under the realization. His gaze followed Marcus, his eyes wide, full of shame. "Please, take my car," he said, almost in a daze, his voice raw. "You'll get there faster. I'll clear the way for you." Marcus didn't hesitate. His heart ached with empathy for the officer, but the time to feel sorry for him had passed. There was a child who needed him. Emily needed him. He nodded sharply, his mind already flipping through the steps of the surgery that awaited him. Every move had to be precise, every decision a calculated step to save her life. The officer, his hands trembling, fumbled for his keys before thrusting them toward Marcus. "I didn't know," he repeated, his voice strained, filled with guilt. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know." Marcus didn't acknowledge the apology. There was no time for that now. He grabbed the keys, his fingers cold against the metal, and without another glance at the officer, he climbed into the squad car. The engine roared to life under his hands as he slammed his foot on the accelerator. The familiar sound of the siren cut through the night air, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to part before him, the streets ahead clearing as if the city itself was making way for him. The officer's car was faster than his own, and Marcus felt the powerful surge of the engine as he sped down the street. The flashing lights illuminated the darkened city, the roads ahead seeming to open up, and in that moment he felt a fleeting sense of clarity, a sense of purpose that drowned out everything else. The past, the frustration, the confusion, the injustice of the traffic stop. None of it mattered now. There was only one thing that mattered: Emily. As he raced toward the hospital, Marcus's mind flashed back to the events of the evening. The call from Emily's father had come in just as Marcus had finished his rounds, the evening nearing its close. He had been deep in thought, reflecting on the cases he had seen that day when the phone had rung. The voice on the other end was frantic, the words tumbling over one another as Emily's father explained the accident. The child, so young and so full of potential, was fighting for her life. Marcus had been brief, but firm in his response. He would be there as soon as possible. Now, as the lights of the hospital came into view, he could feel the adrenaline pulsing through his veins, every second bringing him closer to the operating room, where Emily's life was hanging by a thread. The officers, who had been his obstacle moments ago, had now become his allies in the truest sense. They had given him the keys to their car, clearing the way for him to get to the hospital faster. But still, the clock was ticking. Every moment he spent on the road was another moment Emily could lose. His mind flicked back to the street once again, to the face of the officer who had detained him. The officer's earlier arrogance had been replaced by something far more powerful. Fear. Fear for his daughter's life. The same fear that had crossed every parent's heart when their child was in danger. It wasn't the officer's fault that he had treated Marcus like any other suspect. It wasn't the officer's fault that he had questioned him so harshly. But as Marcus remembered the look in his eyes, the flicker of recognition, and then the sudden collapse of his hardened exterior, he couldn't help but feel a pang of empathy. The officer had been scared for his daughter, and in that moment, he had acted out of that fear. But now, that fear was shared between them both. The officer, in his desperate attempt to understand the situation, had done what any parent might do. He had fought against the unknown, trying to regain control of the chaos. But now, there was no more fighting. There was only the understanding that Marcus was the one person who could help, the one person who could make all the difference. As Marcus turned the corner and saw the bright lights of St. Thomas Medical Center ahead, his thoughts cleared. The emergency department was filled with people, each facing their own crisis. But Marcus had faced this kind of pressure before. He had walked into operating rooms where lives were hanging in the balance. He had done this thousands of times. But this time felt different. This time, the pressure was personal. This time, the patient wasn't just another faceless individual. She was Emily, the daughter of the very man who had stopped him on the street. The car came to a screeching halt in front of the emergency entrance. Marcus didn't wait for the doors to open fully. He was already out of the car and running toward the entrance, his heart racing, his mind focusing on nothing but the task ahead. The hospital's lights shone brightly against the night sky, and the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and urgency. He barely noticed the nurses who were waiting at the door for him, their faces full of determination. They had already prepared the operating room. They had already made room for him. Emily was waiting. Inside, the medical team was already gathered, their faces grim as they stood around the operating table, ready for the battle ahead. But Marcus couldn't afford to dwell on the preparations. He couldn't afford to waste a second. Emily needed him, and he had promised to save her. He scrubbed in quickly, the familiar sound of the surgical gloves snapping into place ringing in his ears. His focus narrowed, his mind shutting out everything except the procedure ahead. Every move, every incision, every decision would be crucial. There could be no room for error. As he stepped into the sterile light of the operating room, he felt his heart calm, the way it always did before a surgery. This was where he was meant to be. But even in that moment, with his hands steady and his mind clear, a part of him couldn't shake the images of the officers, their faces full of guilt, their eyes filled with hope and fear for their daughter. This was more than just another surgery. This was a test of trust, a test of belief. Marcus wasn't just a surgeon to these officers. He was their only hope. And with that thought, he began. The first incision was made, and the battle for Emily's life had begun. The heart of the storm. The sterile white lights of the operating room hummed above Marcus's head, casting sharp, unyielding shadows across the room. Every surgical instrument gleamed with precision and readiness. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic, the scent that was as familiar to Marcus as his own skin. His mind clicked into gear as he stood before the operating table, poised and ready. There was no time for second thoughts, no room for doubt. The young girl lying before him, pale and frail, was the daughter of the officer he had just encountered. His sworn duty was now far more personal. Marcus could feel the adrenaline coursing through him, his pulse syncing with the beeping monitors that measured the girl's heart rate. Each beat was weaker than the last. The room was quiet but tense, each member of the surgical team in their place, waiting for Marcus to guide them through the steps of the operation. The surgical nurses stood by, instruments in hand, their expressions calm but filled with the weight of the situation. Emily's life was on the line, and Marcus was the only one who could save her. But in the stillness of the room, his thoughts betrayed him. The memory of his encounter with the officer on the street kept flashing through his mind, unbidden. The face of the officer, his hardened demeanor, then the sharp shift when he recognized Marcus's identity, was seared into his memory. The way the officer had hesitated, the guilt in his eyes, and the realization that Marcus was the very person he needed. It had been a moment of profound humility for the officer, and for Marcus, it had been a lesson in the fragility of life, the misjudgments made under pressure, and the lengths people would go to when faced with the unimaginable. But there was no time for reflection now. His focus shifted entirely to the task at hand. Emily needed him. The officer's desperate plea for help echoed in his mind, but the hospital was now the battleground, and Marcus was ready to fight. His gaze fell to the small, fragile form of Emily. She was a child, barely 8 years old, and her small body, so full of potential, was now ravaged by trauma. Her skin was pale, a faint tint of blue clinging to her lips from lack of oxygen. Her body trembled slightly with each shallow breath she took, the machinery around her body working tirelessly to keep her alive as she fought against the extensive internal injuries. Her body was broken, both on the outside and within, and without immediate intervention, there was no guarantee she would survive the night. Marcus could see it in her face, the delicate, youthful innocence that had been shattered by the collision. Her injuries were severe, multiple fractures, a ruptured spleen, internal bleeding from damage to her vital organs, and a heart that was struggling to keep up. The room's monitors were an ever-present reminder of the grim reality. Emily's heart rate was dangerously low, her oxygen levels hovering just above the threshold of what the human body could endure. The trauma had overwhelmed her systems, and the only way she had a chance was through the skill of a surgeon who could work quickly and effectively. As Marcus stood over her, his hand steady and his mind calculating, he couldn't help but think of her parents, the officer who had stopped him on the street, a man whose only goal that night had been to protect his daughter. The officer's face had reflected so much in that brief encounter: concern, confusion, guilt. But there was also fear, the kind of fear no parent could ever prepare for, the fear of losing a child. Marcus's grip on the scalpel tightened as his thoughts refocused. There was no more room for distraction. The father of this little girl had trusted him, had recognized his skills, had given him the keys to the police car to get him to this very moment. That trust couldn't be broken. Marcus's only goal was to bring Emily back from the brink. He glanced at the surgical team, each member in sync with him, their eyes sharp, their hands precise. The anesthesiologist, standing quietly in the corner, kept a careful eye on Emily's vitals. The nurses, their faces set in focused determination, stood ready, their hands prepared to pass instruments to Marcus with expert precision. It was a well-rehearsed dance, a symphony of movement that could only be achieved by a team that had worked together countless times. But this was different. The room felt charged with the intensity of the moment. No one had to say it. Everyone knew what was at stake. Marcus's first incision was deliberate, swift, but gentle. The scalpel cut through Emily's skin with ease, and the team followed his lead, moving quickly but with the care that only years of training and experience could provide. The soft hum of the machines, the rhythm of the surgical instruments, all blended together in a steady flow that helped Marcus zone in on the task before him. His hands moved methodically, navigating the intricate web of injuries inside Emily's tiny body. He could feel the pressure building in his chest, but he ignored it. The momentary flash of doubt that had passed through him when he first laid eyes on Emily's bruised, fragile form was replaced with the quiet confidence that only years of practice could provide. He had been here before, on countless occasions, facing life or death decisions, surgeries that hung in the balance. He had saved lives, had been called a miracle worker, had pulled patients back from the brink of death more times than he could count. But this was different. This was personal. There was a small part of Marcus's mind that recognized this fact, that knew that the father of this child was the officer who had doubted him just hours earlier. But that thought faded away as the room filled with a silent urgency. Emily's life depended on every movement, every second that passed. Marcus could feel the sweat on his brow as the minutes dragged on, each one a battle against the internal bleeding that threatened to overwhelm her body. The internal bleeding was the first obstacle they had to address. Her spleen had been ruptured in the accident, causing massive internal hemorrhaging. The procedure was complicated. One wrong move, one slip of the scalpel, and the situation could worsen. But Marcus's hands were steady. He worked through the mess of blood vessels, carefully sealing them off, knowing that every successful move brought him closer to stabilizing her. As the team worked in synchrony, Marcus felt the intensity of the moment shift. The child's body, once an untapped source of potential and vitality, was now a battlefield. But Marcus was a soldier in this fight, and every cut, every stitch, every calculated movement was a step closer to saving her. The room was quiet, save for the beeping of the monitors. The only sound was the rhythm of the surgical instruments as they moved across Emily's body. The tension in the air was palpable. Everyone in the room could feel the stakes. The team's focus was absolute. Each of them knew how delicate the situation was. There could be no mistakes. There was no room for error. Hours seemed to blur together as Marcus worked, his focus unyielding. Each incision revealed more damage than he had expected. Multiple fractures in Emily's ribs had punctured her lungs, causing them to collapse. Her liver had been badly torn, and there was damage to the arteries that supplied blood to her organs. Her body, so small and fragile, had been ravaged by the collision. But as Marcus carefully repaired the damage, he couldn't help but wonder about the officer outside the room. What was he thinking? What was he feeling as his daughter's life hung in the balance? The man had been so determined, so focused on protecting his child, yet it was Marcus, someone he had mistakenly judged, who held her future in his hands. It wasn't lost on Marcus that the officer was probably pacing in the hospital corridors, waiting for any news, hoping against hope that his daughter would survive. Marcus could picture the officer's face, pale and anxious, his eyes constantly darting toward the door, waiting for the surgical team to emerge with news of Emily's condition. The same officer who had stopped him on the street, who had doubted his intentions, was now, in a way, relying on him. Marcus's breath quickened as he continued his work, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His hands moved faster now, his focus unwavering, but the strain was beginning to take its toll. Emily's heart rate was still dangerously low, her blood pressure fluctuating erratically. The longer this went on, the harder it was to keep her body stable. Marcus's hands trembled slightly, but he didn't allow himself to falter. Not now. Not with everything on the line. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they reached the most critical point of the surgery. The internal bleeding had been controlled, and the major fractures had been addressed. But Emily's vital organs, her heart, liver, and lungs, had all taken too much trauma. They were still struggling to function properly. Marcus knew that if her heart stopped, if her organs gave out, there would be no coming back. The monitor beeped once more, and Marcus's heart skipped a beat. The numbers were dropping. Emily's heart rate was slowing. Her oxygen levels were plummeting. "Transfusion," Marcus called out, his voice steady, but tinged with urgency. The nurse quickly handed over the blood bags, and Marcus started the transfusion. It was his final attempt to stabilize her, to give her body the blood it needed to continue fighting. Every second mattered now. Emily had been hanging on for so long. He couldn't let her slip away now. The longest night. The rhythmic beeping of the monitor was the only sound that filled the sterile operating room, its repetition a reminder of how fragile the line between life and death truly was. Marcus had performed countless surgeries, but something about this one gnawed at him differently. This was more than a patient. This was a child, the daughter of a man who had stopped him on the street, not knowing that he was the only person who could save her. The weight of this truth pressed on Marcus's chest like an invisible hand. As he continued to work, sweat beaded on his forehead, his body drenched in the heat of the operating room. His hands were steady, but his thoughts were far from calm. Emily's condition had improved slightly, but the battle was far from over. Her vitals remained unstable, her heart rate dropping dangerously low. Her body, so small and delicate, had been ravaged by the accident, and though the surgery had addressed the major issues, Marcus knew that without a breakthrough, her chances of survival were slim. He couldn't let that happen. Not after everything that had brought him here, not after the officer's desperate plea, not after the understanding that had passed between them in the streets just hours ago. The officer who had questioned him, doubted him, had no idea that he had been holding the key to his daughter's survival. That moment of tension between them had shifted into something else, a raw, unspoken understanding of just how fragile life could be. Marcus glanced at the clock. Time seemed to stretch and bend as the minutes turned into what felt like hours, but there was no luxury of time. Each second was critical. The transfusion was in full swing, but Emily's body was still struggling to absorb the blood. Her heart was failing, and no matter how steady his hands were, he knew there was only so much he could do. The heart rate monitor flickered, a sharp warning that cut through the quiet of the room. His mind raced through every possible step. He had repaired the internal bleeding, had stabilized the ruptured organs. He had done everything by the book. Every incision, every stitch had been calculated, precise. But nothing seemed to be enough. Emily's body was resisting recovery, fighting him at every turn, and there was no clear reason why. The procedures had been textbook, yet the outcome still hung by a thread. One of the nurses, her face flushed from the heat of the room, approached him with a look of concern. "Doctor, her blood pressure is dropping again," she said softly, but the edge of panic in her voice was unmistakable. Marcus's heart sank. This wasn't the first time her blood pressure had plummeted, and each time it did, the reality of the situation became more dire. Marcus nodded, his mind still sharp despite the increasing weight of the pressure. "Increase the transfusion rate. Get more blood in her. I'll need to stabilize her heart." The nurse didn't hesitate, moving to follow his command. There was a synchronized efficiency in the way the team worked, each member responding to Marcus's orders without a second thought. They were all invested in this, in Emily's life. But as Marcus's hands moved quickly, expertly, through the surgical site, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that time was slipping away faster than he could act. He stepped back for a moment, wiping the sweat from his brow. The room was hot, too hot. As the tension mounted, he could feel the pressure in his chest, the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had been here before, in surgeries that felt like a race against time, but never like this, never with so much on the line. He stared down at Emily's small form, her face pale, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Despite the severity of her injuries, there was something in her that still held on, a tiny spark of life that refused to go out. It was a testament to her strength, to the fighting spirit that lived in her. But it was also a reminder of how much was at stake. This was no longer just a surgery. It was a battle for a life. Marcus closed his eyes for a brief moment, centering himself, allowing the chaos of the room to recede. This was the moment that defined everything. The choice he had to make, the decisions that would determine whether Emily survived. He wasn't just operating on a body. He was fighting for a future, for a family, for a father who had trusted him in the most unimaginable circumstances. He opened his eyes, his resolve hardening like steel. There would be no failure. Not tonight. Not with everything on the line. His hands moved again, quickly but with precision, repositioning Emily's heart under the guidance of the machines that were monitoring her every beat. He could see the faint flicker of hope in the numbers on the monitor. A slight increase in her heart rate, a small rise in her oxygen levels. It was nothing substantial, but it was something. And something was better than nothing. "Keep pushing the blood," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We need to get her heart beating stronger. Her organs need the blood flow to kickstart recovery. If we can't stabilize her heart, nothing else will matter." The nurse moved quickly, her hand steady as she continued the transfusion, adjusting the IV bags and the rate of blood delivery. The anesthesiologist quietly observed, watching the data that flowed through the machines. The rest of the team worked in synchronized silence, each of them focused, but each of them also acutely aware of the time running out. The moments stretched into what felt like an eternity. The flickering monitor, the thumping of Emily's weak heart, the soft sound of breathing. It all merged into a single, overwhelming wave of sound and motion. Marcus's thoughts were fragmented, as if his mind was caught in a whirlwind, but he didn't allow himself to get lost in it. He couldn't afford to. Not now. As he leaned over Emily, his fingers steadying the IV lines, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. The faintest movement of her fingers, just a twitch, like a whisper of life returning. His breath caught in his throat. It was small, so small that it might have been nothing, but to Marcus, it was everything. "Did you see that?" he asked the nurse, his voice rising slightly, filled with cautious hope. The nurse looked down, her face lit with a tentative smile. "Yes, doctor. I think she's responding." It was a small victory, but it was enough to reignite the spark of hope that had been waning within Marcus. He straightened up, his back stiff, his posture sharpening. There was still work to be done, but the road ahead felt clearer. The odds had shifted, if only slightly. He could feel Emily's pulse becoming a little stronger beneath his fingertips. Her blood pressure was stabilizing, inching back to something more normal. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. It was a sign, a small, fragile sign, that she was fighting, that her body was beginning to respond. Marcus glanced at the clock again. It had been over 2 hours since the surgery had begun, and the fight for Emily's life was far from over. But in that moment, he allowed himself to exhale, to feel something other than the crushing weight of the night. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was a glimmer of hope, a sign that the worst might be over. But Marcus knew better than to let his guard down completely. There was still so much work to do. Emily's recovery wasn't guaranteed, and the next steps were just as critical as the ones that had come before. But for now, for this brief, fleeting moment, Marcus allowed himself to hold on to the small victory. A twitch of fingers, a slight improvement in her heart rate. It wasn't a cure, but it was a sign that the storm was beginning to pass. He looked up at the ceiling, the cool lights above his head casting a stark glow on the sterile walls. As he did, his thoughts wandered again to the officer, the father outside the operating room, waiting for news, hoping for a miracle. Marcus knew what the officer was feeling, that mixture of hope and terror, the weight of waiting for something, anything, that could let him know his daughter would survive. And Marcus knew as he continued to work that he was the only one who could give that to him. He was the one who could make the difference. He had to. The storm wasn't over, not yet, But Marcus had learned long ago that it was never the storm that defined a man. It was what he did in the heart of it that mattered. And tonight, Marcus would do whatever it took to bring Emily back from the brink. He would not let this be the night he failed. Not when a child's future and a father's hope depended on him. The tipping point. The sterile walls of the operating room seemed to close in around Marcus as he stood over Emily, his mind a whirlwind of calculations and possibilities. The initial signs of improvement, the flicker of movement in her fingers, had been small, but they had sparked a fire within him, a spark of hope that had been all but extinguished by the earlier moments of crisis. But hope, Marcus knew, was fragile. A brief flicker of life could be snuffed out in an instant. His thoughts raced as he continued his work, his hands steady as they moved with purpose. But the weight of the moment pressed heavily on him. Her vitals were stabilizing, but not enough. Her blood pressure had risen slightly, and her oxygen levels were inching back to normal. But her heart was still weak, struggling to maintain a steady rhythm. Emily was still a long way from being out of danger. The pressure of the situation was suffocating, and as the minutes ticked by, Marcus felt the tight knot of anxiety in his chest growing, pushing him to work faster, more urgently. The nurses and anesthesiologist moved like shadows in the background, their movements smooth and practiced as they adjusted equipment, monitored her vitals, and prepared for whatever might come next. The sound of the heart rate monitor continued to pulse in the background, its rhythmic beeping now something of a comforting presence. If it stayed steady, it meant Emily was holding on. If it faltered, there would be no time to correct it. Marcus felt his body tightening with every passing moment. The initial shock of the accident had worn off, but the toll it had taken on Emily's small body was still evident. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and every breath she took seemed to require all of her energy. Her tiny chest rose and fell with shallow, labored breaths, her body still fighting to stay alive. The girl's once bright eyes were now closed, her face an expression of exhaustion. But even in her unconscious state, her body continued to fight. Fighting. That was the word that kept coming back to Marcus's mind. She was fighting. She was strong, far stronger than he had realized. The body's will to survive was something Marcus had seen countless times before, but it always amazed him. The way a person could hold on, against all odds, even when the situation seemed hopeless. Emily, in her fragile state, was fighting for everything she had, and he wasn't about to let her down. He stepped back for a moment, allowing his gaze to linger over the scene before him. The beeping monitors, the surgical tools neatly arranged on the tray, the team working with unwavering focus. For a brief second, he let his mind wander, just long enough to recognize the weight of what had brought him here. He wasn't just another surgeon performing an operation. He was the man who had the power to give this little girl another chance at life, to return her to her father, who was waiting anxiously outside, unaware of the storm that was raging within his daughter's body. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply. He had been in so many surgeries, had seen so many lives slip away, had brought so many people back from the brink of death. But this was different. Emily's father wasn't just a patient's family member. He was a part of the community, a protector of the streets Marcus had lived on for years. The officer's call had been personal, and the moment they'd shared on the street had underscored just how much was at stake, not just for Emily, but for her father. The officer had recognized Marcus as the one person who could help when it seemed like everything else was falling apart. The more Marcus thought about it, the more it became clear how much pressure was on him. He wasn't just dealing with a patient's life. He was dealing with the officer's trust, his desperate need for his daughter to survive. He had seen that trust, had felt it in the officer's shaking hands as he handed over his car keys, his face filled with guilt and regret. Marcus couldn't let that trust go unfulfilled. He had promised that he would save Emily, and he wasn't going to break that promise. The moment of silence was shattered by the sudden change in Emily's vitals. The heart rate monitor beeped erratically, the numbers fluctuating wildly. Marcus's eyes snapped open, his heart racing as he saw the line on the screen begin to flatten. "Her heart rate is dropping," the nurse said urgently, her voice trembling slightly. "Blood pressure's falling again." Marcus's mind immediately went into overdrive. They had come so far, but it was clear that the battle wasn't over. Emily's body was still too fragile, too damaged to stabilize completely. The blood transfusion hadn't been enough to revive her heart, and there was a new threat emerging. Her organs, still in shock from the trauma, were beginning to fail again. "Prep the chest," Marcus ordered, his voice steady but filled with an underlying urgency. He turned toward the team, his mind already working through the necessary steps. "We need to get her heart functioning again. Double the transfusion rate. Make sure we've got everything we need to stabilize her." The team sprang into action, each member moving with speed and precision. Marcus didn't need to say much more. They had worked together countless times before, and they all knew what had to be done. The anesthesiologist adjusted the settings on the ventilator, while the nurses increased the rate of blood transfusion, pushing the IV lines into overdrive. Every second felt like an eternity. Marcus focused solely on Emily's chest, his hands moving quickly as he prepared for what he knew was coming next. He would have to manually restart her heart, something he had done before, but rarely in such a young child. This wasn't the same as applying defibrillation to an adult, where a single jolt could restore a heartbeat. Emily's heart, still small and fragile, required a much more delicate touch. He positioned his hands carefully over her chest, feeling for the right pressure points, the right angle. The monitors around him seemed to blur in his peripheral vision as he centered all his focus on the task at hand. The pressure of the situation was immense, but Marcus had been here before. He had felt the weight of the world on his shoulders during countless surgeries. He had stared down at the edge of life and death so many times, but this time it felt different. This time there was something more personal at stake. Taking a deep breath, Marcus pressed down, his hands firm but gentle, applying the necessary force to massage Emily's heart, attempting to coax it back to life. The seconds seemed to stretch on forever, and the team held their collective breath, waiting for the slightest indication that his efforts were working. The heart rate monitor remained erratic, the beeping sharp and uneven, until finally a faint flicker of life appeared. The numbers on the screen slowly began to climb, a tiny victory in the middle of the storm. For a brief moment, Marcus allowed himself to exhale, just a small breath of relief, but he didn't allow it to linger. There was no time to feel comfortable. The fight was far from over. He needed Emily's heart to regain strength. He needed her organs to respond. The real work was just beginning. The nurse, watching the monitor, reported, "Heart rate is increasing. Oxygen levels are better. Her blood pressure is rising again." Marcus didn't take his eyes off the screen. The tiny flicker of improvement, the return of hope, was everything he needed to continue. Every small improvement, every fraction of a percentage increase in Emily's condition, was a sign that they were getting closer to saving her. But even as the tension in the room began to ease, Marcus's thoughts couldn't help but shift back to Emily's father, the officer who had once questioned him. The officer who had stood in the cold night, uncertain, and now the one who was probably pacing in the hallways, waiting for news. His daughter's life was still hanging by a thread, but they had made it this far. Marcus had to finish the job. The officer's hope, his faith, was now resting entirely on Marcus's hands. The weight of that was not lost on him, and he knew that no matter what, he couldn't allow this little girl to slip away. Not after everything they had been through. Not when the possibility of life, however small, was finally within reach. The storm wasn't over yet, but Marcus had seen enough to know that the tide was beginning to shift. The fight for Emily's life was not over, but it was now one that could be won. He would keep pushing, keep fighting, because there was nothing more important in this moment than bringing her back. The dawn of hope. The hum of the operating room seemed louder now, the sound of the ventilator as it pushed air into Emily's lungs, the steady beeping of the monitors, the swift shuffle of feet, all blending into a chaotic symphony. But in Marcus's mind, the world outside the sterile space had fallen silent. Time was no longer a tangible thing. It was suspended in the air, a series of fleeting moments that held the weight of Emily's life in their hands. His heart thudded in his chest, not in panic, but with the focused intensity of someone who knew that the smallest misstep could tip the scales. Emily's heart had started to respond to the intervention, but she was still fragile. Her body was slowly catching up to the demands of the blood transfusion, her organs trying to regain their function, but it was clear that this fight wasn't over. Her skin, though no longer the sickly shade of deathly pallor, still carried the faint touch of a child who had been through something far beyond her years. Her small body, so full of life and possibility, had been shattered in an instant, and Marcus knew that the path to her recovery would be as fraught with danger as the battle they had just fought to save her. The room was quieter now, the initial flurry of activity settling into a calm focus. Every member of the surgical team knew the stakes. They were no longer just doctors and nurses. They were the guardians of a child's future, and they had all been given a second chance to fight for it. The weight of their collective responsibility pressed on their shoulders, but their movements were precise, calm. This wasn't just about saving Emily anymore. It was about giving her a future. They were walking a fine line, and every choice, every action mattered. Marcus's eyes flickered over the monitors, checking the flow of blood, the heart rate, the oxygen levels. The numbers were improving, but just barely. Her heart, still weak, was beating more steadily, the rhythm of life returning. But it was delicate. Marcus's hands remained steady, even as his mind raced, thinking ahead, calculating the next step. He didn't allow himself to think about how close they had come to losing her. It was too dangerous. They were past that. The work wasn't done yet, but they were beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel. "Doctor, her blood pressure's stabilizing," one of the nurses reported, breaking the silence. Marcus glanced over, his breath catching in his chest as he saw the slight but significant change in the monitor. The numbers were creeping upward, slowly but steadily, and that alone was enough to give them all a glimmer of hope. He nodded, his eyes scanning the other screens in front of him. Emily's pulse was still weak, but it was no longer at the brink of failure. Marcus's thoughts briefly drifted to the officer, the man whose daughter he was fighting to save. The officer had trusted him, despite the tension and confusion of their earlier encounter. He had seen something in Marcus, a recognition that hadn't been there before, and it had allowed Marcus to do his job, to save his daughter. It was a powerful realization for Marcus, one that stayed with him as he worked. He wasn't just saving a patient, he was saving a family. He was saving the officer's future. His gaze returned to Emily. The child, so fragile beneath the lights, her body still fighting against the damage done. Her tiny chest rose and fell with each breath, slightly stronger now, her heart picking up the pace with each passing minute. Her pale lips, tinged with the remnants of a deathly blue, were slowly regaining a hint of their natural color. She wasn't out of danger yet, but her body was beginning to believe it could survive. "Let's get a CT scan," Marcus said suddenly, breaking the silence once more. "We need to check the extent of the internal damage. I want a full evaluation before we make any more decisions." He didn't want to take chances. The surgery had addressed the immediate damage, but Emily had suffered severe trauma, the kind that wouldn't show up immediately, but could still put her life at risk. The nurse who had been monitoring the machines nodded. "We're ready, doctor. We'll get her prepped and transfer her immediately." Marcus didn't respond. He wasn't sure if Emily was truly out of the woods, but he couldn't allow any lingering doubt to cloud his judgment. His mind was calculating, working out the best path forward, even as his hands continued to guide the team. The scans would provide the answers he needed, answers that would guide him on the next phase of the recovery. Emily wasn't out of danger yet. He had to make sure there weren't any other hidden injuries. The room emptied briefly as the team prepared Emily for the CT scan. Marcus stayed behind for a moment, taking a deep breath, collecting his thoughts. The moment felt surreal. Emily's life was still fragile, but she was holding on. There was something in that persistence, that will to survive, that made Marcus believe in the possibility of hope. Hope was a dangerous thing, but it was also a powerful one. It was what had carried him through this surgery, and it was what would carry him through the days ahead as Emily continued her fight. As the CT scan began, Marcus walked into the small break room near the operating area. His hands were shaking slightly, a reaction he hadn't expected. He had kept his composure through the chaos of the surgery, but now, in the quiet after the storm, his mind was starting to process everything he had just been through. Emily's father, the officer, had no idea how close they had come to losing her. And now Marcus was faced with a choice: to continue to hope or to face the possibility of defeat. But he couldn't allow defeat to be an option. Not now. Not after everything they had fought for. He rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the exhaustion that had begun to seep into his bones. It had been hours, and though he had stayed calm throughout the entire procedure, the toll of the night was starting to weigh on him. The fight had been long, and it wasn't over yet, but the victory was no longer as distant as it had seemed when they had first started. Emily's chances were improving. The door opened, and one of the nurses walked in, holding a small tablet with the results of the scan. Marcus's heart skipped a beat as he looked at the images. The scan showed that the majority of the internal injuries had been addressed during surgery. There were still some lingering concerns, but nothing that was immediately life-threatening. The fractures had healed, the internal bleeding had been contained, and the organs that had been in shock were slowly starting to recover. Marcus exhaled a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He had done it. They had done it. Emily was going to make it. The road to recovery would be long, but it was no longer a question of if she would survive. It was a matter of how quickly her body would heal. A smile, rare and fleeting, crossed Marcus's face as he looked at the nurse. "Prepare her for recovery. We'll keep her under observation for a while longer, but it's looking good." The nurse smiled back, relief flooding her face. "Thank you, doctor." Marcus nodded, his heart still racing as he stepped back toward the operating room. He couldn't allow himself to relax yet, not completely. But he knew the worst was over. Emily was alive. And that was the victory he had been fighting for. As he made his way down the hallway, his thoughts turned again to the officer. What would he say to him? What would he say when he saw the father's face, the man who had so desperately wanted to save his daughter? Would the officer understand the weight of what had just happened? Would he realize that it was more than just a successful surgery? That it was a second chance at life? Marcus's footsteps slowed as he reached the waiting area. He saw the officer, pacing anxiously, his uniform still pristine, but his face drawn with concern. His eyes flickered toward Marcus, and in that moment, everything seemed to slow down. The officer's gaze locked with Marcus's, and for a second, neither man spoke. It wasn't necessary. The gratitude, the unspoken understanding, passed between them in that moment. "She's going to make it," Marcus said finally, his voice softer than it had been all night. The officer blinked, then swallowed hard, his eyes filling with tears. He nodded, unable to speak at first. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for saving my little girl." Marcus's heart swelled with something he hadn't expected, a sense of fulfillment, of purpose. He had done it. Emily was alive. And the officer's faith in him, in that moment of desperation, had turned a tragic night into a second chance. And for Marcus, that was enough.